So I have a kind of a religious question to ask you about that. This is something I've been thinking about lately. In Christianity, broadly speaking, you could make the case from a psychological perspective that utopia is permanently forestalled into the future in the name of the afterlife or of heaven or something like that. So it's abstracted up into something that's then put in a distant place. And I'm wondering to some degree if that's not a consequence of attempts to remove the danger from assumptions of potential utopias here and now. Because I'd like to look at religious thinking from an evolutionary perspective or a biological perspective. And it's very curious to me that the idea of the utopia, let's say, would be forestalled in that way. Any thoughts about that? I know it's a strange question.
Well, we have ideas about heaven that seem to be not universal, but there are features of heaven that seem to recur. Maybe we'll get into this later if we talk about psychedelics, but there are certain visions of heaven and hell. And so the idea of heaven, which often seems so perfectly beautiful, the idea of it's perfectly beautiful, but it's got its weird political problems. And these people, that just doesn't make any cognitive sense. Better to have it all be good and perfect and pure and hell be all, perfectly terrible. I don't know what was motivating the early Christians. I have no insights into that, but a way that I do psychology, and actually, Jordan, I know that you do too, because when you and I first met when I had my first job interview at Harvard in 1994, and you were the only person on the faculty then that I connected with, but we both bonded over an interest in Jung. And while I don't embrace some of the more fanciful elements of Jung, but the idea of archetypes, the idea that there are images that occur to people around the world because they come out of our evolutionary past. Something about our minds readily imagines them because of something was adaptive long ago, and so that's what got me into the study of disgust and purity and pollution. Mm-hmm. Was when I started reading ethnographies and seeing that all these cultures that never had any communication, many of them are island nations in the Pacific, they all had some similar ideas about purity and pollution. And so I would guess similarly with heaven and hell.
Yeah, well, it's interesting to me that if earthbound utopias present a continual political danger in the way that we've been discussing, that one way out of that might be to permanently forestall it. And we also talked archetypally already, because you guys mentioned the fact that it's easy for political discussions to degenerate into something like an archetypal struggle between good and evil, right? It's that base level category that seems to emerge and confuse things when they need to be more specified and precise.
Jordan, you're supposing that there is some sort of an evolutionary system that there has been enough competition between cultures that the ones that were utopian didn't win out, or you're assuming that somebody had access to enough data of world historical societies to realize that utopias tend to end in bloodshed. And guess what? Here we are in 2100, and while a few social scientists know it, many people are still utopian. So I think I would not look for some adaptive thing like, the Christians were very wise in putting utopia impossibly far in the future because they knew that if they put it in the present, it'll be terrible. No, I doubt that.
I wouldn't think they knew. I don't imagine it's anything that was planned. It just strikes me that the idea is so prevalent, that utopian thinking is so prevalent, that it might be necessary to develop a psychological mechanism to make its existence safe. I was thinking in some sense the same thing about ideas of God, and I don't know what you guys think about this, but it seems to me that it's possible that if there isn't a place in society for something like an ultimate value, then that degenerates down to the political level and starts to contaminate it. So if there is such a thing as a religious instinct, let's say, if it doesn't find its proper place that in abstraction, then you elevate other elements of society to the same level, and then that becomes dangerous.
Well, it depends on what you elevate. If what you're elevating is human well-being, people should be healthy and happy and long-lived and educated and safe. That doesn't seem like such a bad moral value to elevate, and it's certainly better than some arbitrary stipulation from some scripture or creed that you can't justify to people who don't believe it antecedently. I mean, the problem with utopia is, I mean, among the problems, and I'm not sure, by the way, I'm the least qualified person on earth to talk about Christian theology or eschatology, but it seems to me there's also the notion of the second coming. There's end times, there's heaven on earth. I mean, there are notions of utopia that are seem to me not necessarily postponed indefinitely. But the problem with utopia, of course, is that it ignores the inherent trade-offs in the human condition, such as that if you can't have complete freedom and complete well-being, because people will choose to do things that screw up their lives. So unless you have a totalitarian nanny state, you give people freedom, they're going to do things that will lead to some bad outcomes. We're not all identical, and therefore anything that carries out the vision of some of us is going to be inimical to others. And so that's why a liberal democracy is basically a means for resolving disagreements, not a vision of what life ought to be. There's an inherent trade-off between equality of outcome and equality of opportunity or rights. And since we're not all clones, that means that if you just allow people to achieve the most they can, some people will achieve more than others, and there is that trade-off if you don't want to have extremes of inequality. Added to the inevitability that whatever your vision of utopia is going to be, not everyone's going to agree with you, and in order to carry out a scheme that is perfectly laid out on paper, how do you deal with the people who don't get with the program? If you sincerely believe that the people who disagree with you are the only thing standing between the current world and a world that will be infinitely good forever, then you're justified in doing anything possible there to eliminate the ultimate evil, namely your enemies.
Exactly. Well, that's why it seems to be such a hazard, right? Because utopia, if utopia is perfect and it can be attained, then any means are acceptable to bring it about. And that I can't think of a more profound moral hazard than that.
Yeah, we're all kind of channeling Isaiah Berlin here, but they're good arguments.